Buenos días. Cuando nuestros colegas en la
Good morning. When our host lets us know, we are ready to begin the press conference. For colleagues from abroad, in the meantime, I would just like to let you know that we are on the 14th floor. This is a safe building. In the event there were to be an emergency, the alarm will go off, and I would like for you to go to the edge of the room toward the walls, and an official from the hotel will lead us through the evacuation process. So I would like to just request that you let us know when you're ready to begin.
me van a decir cuándo entrar al aire. Me van a hacer el cómputo para saber cuándo entrar al aire que se conecte. 5, 4, 3.
O sea, no están conectados.
No estamos entrando la señal. Ahí va. Ahí está. Buenos días, saludos desde la Ciudad de México.
Good morning, greetings from Mexico City. I'm Maria Luisa Leon. I am a public information officer at the sub-regional office of ECLAC in Mexico, and today we have a report on ECLAC's annual publication entitled Panorama of Production Development and Policies in Latin America and the Caribbean 2025. We, at our sub-regional office, we are joined virtually by individuals from on the different platforms of the Commission. Now, the presentation of this document will be made by the ECLAC Executive Secretary, Mr. Jose Manuel Salazar sitting next, and by the Director of the Production and Business Development Division, Marco Lineas. We are joined here at the table as well by the Director of ECLAC Sub-Regional Office in Mexico, Mr. Mario Rivas Piva, and we would also like to greet the director of ECLAC's offices in Brazil, Camila Graham Cao. Following the presentation on the panorama, we will begin the Q&A round. I would like to remind the journalists that who are joining us online to please submit your questions via the WebEx chat or at the or via the email conferenciaprensa@eclac.org. Executive Secretary, you have been recognized. Thank you. Good morning to everyone, ladies and gentlemen, joining us here today in this meeting room to listen to the presentation on the panorama of productive development policies in Latin America and the Caribbean. I would like to greet everyone joining us here in person as well, and those online. Prior to beginning, I would like to thank the team from the Production and Business Development Division at ECLAC and their director, Marco Lineas, who actually presided over the publication of this report. There is a chapter on inclusive green policies, and this was led by Camila Gramcar, our director from the ECLAC offices in Brazil. She and her team are joining us here as well. Thank you. I would also like to thank the rest of the divisions and ECLAC offices who took part in drafting this document, as well as all of the consultants and editors who also made their contribution and bettered the publication. I would also recognize the presence of Mr. Martinez from the Mexico ECLAC office. This office covers Mexico, Cuba, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, and the rest of Central America. And I would like to thank him and his team for organizing this event. We are very pleased to be launching this second version of the new flagship document, which analyzes some of the historic issues addressed at ECLAC. And I am referring to this topic that is of incredible importance for the countries in the region, perhaps more so than ever. Now, these production development policies are key. And ever since my arrival at ECLAC, I have been focused on coming up with a second version of this flagship document. There's not a single other organization producing a document such as this one or similar to this one, and you know how important it is to have this discussion regarding production development policies in the LAC region. We know that in the region it's important to scale up our policies in keeping with this new policy division, and as a result, this publication takes on in, increased importance given as well the current context marked by conflict, technological innovation, because given this new world order, we see that policy trends are focused on production sectors of strategic minerals, food sector, renewable energy, technology, and more. All of these aspects are at the heart of economic competition, and therefore growth strategies, competition strategies, job development strategies in countries today must involve having clear production development sectoral strategies and policies. And this is only possible if we fully understand the trends and policies today regarding technological innovation in the major powers. It's a reality, so we need to understand it as such. Now, if our economic growth and production growth in our region is related to the lack of economic diversification, to the lack of technological sophistication in previous decades, it is therefore necessary to raise the bar in terms of ambition and have sectoral strategies. Therefore, this new economic global context reinforces this need, making it crucial. I hope the countries and governments will able to take advantage of this to create competitive advantages, to foster their growth, their prosperity, their job market, etc. Now, if not doing this, there's a risk. We are in jeopardy of having this new context become a risk and not an opportunity, and a new source of vulnerability. And we're in jeopardy of moving towards another potential lost decade, leading to a lack of employment and poverty. Therefore, this document is very important, as well as the topic addressed therein. In fact, the title goes to the heart of this challenge, and the title is How Can We Escape the Trap of Low Growth Capacity to Grow? And that is one of the issues that we have been discussing for quite a while, and it's crucial. Now, this is not by chance. In addition to addressing different aspects regarding production development, the document provides policy recommendations with regard to what to do and how the countries and their territories in the region can scale up production development policies and thus trigger a production development that will lead to greater productivity and greater well-being for all.
A ver, el contenido.
Now, the content of this presentation has been broken down into 5 sections, which coincide with the structure of the report. The first one refers to having a deeper analysis with regard to the what we addressed in the first version in terms of productivity and product development policies. The second issue is regarding science, technology, and innovation policies. We know that production development includes a variety of different nuances, and so we have addressed these in this version. And then the third chapter refers to cluster initiatives and other productive coordination initiatives for production development, and the fourth addresses green and inclusive productive development policies, analyzing the connection between productive development policies and climate aspects. This is a new emerging crucial issue with regard to a great potential in terms of green growth and climate adaptation and mitigation, etc. for development policies. And then the last section refers to final reflections. As an introduction, I just would like to remind you that we come up with a baseline diagnostic with regard to the region, and we have referred to 3 traps. The first is the trap of low capacity for growth. The second one is high inequality, low social mobility, and weak social cohesion trap. And the third one is related to the trap of low institutional capacity, ineffective governance. Now, with regard to the first trap, we know that there's a significant evidence. The region from 2014 to 2023 only grew at 0.4% per year. That's less than the 2% of growth that was that took place in the 80s. And we have wrapped up a second lost decade, and we would like to prevent a third one. So it's not just about growth. If you look at the poverty data, you can also see that there's a poverty reduction curve that begins in the 90s. It continues through the next decade, the first decade of this century, but then it starts flattening off around 2014, 2015. And we also have, in the second lost decade, the lowest employment rates seen. And if you look at the most recent UNDP report on Human Development Index, you can see that the Human Development Index was improving and then it started flattening off as well, beginning in 2014, 2015. So when we say that the growth rate is 0.9, excuse me, 0.9, not 0.4, we see that has an impact on everything. With regard to the second,
this has also injected greater, there's been a boost for labor markets. If labor markets are not dynamic, it's very difficult to have quality jobs and to reduce informality. And in addition, this is one of the main ascending social mobility mechanisms, together with the quality of education and professional training system. So we're also the most unequal region in the world. That is the second trap. And the third trap also has clear evidence in the sense that there is weakness when it comes to institutional capacity. So there are two indices. We're not going to delve on that, but it does form part of the issue because we require institutional capacities in all transformation areas, including productive transformation. Well, that is the general context of the region in a very summarized fashion. And the main messages of this report, so that we can continue to analyze the substantive part of the report. The first message is that Latin America and the Caribbean are going to be able to escape the low growth capacity if it doesn't deal with a major challenge of productivity and productive transformation. And for that purpose, it must escalate and improve these productive development policies via a new vision that we have outlined and that we continue to explain in this report. Secondly, this, among others, requires aligning efforts in science, technology, and innovation in our countries and its territories with productive transformation of their economies. In other words, we feel that they are not adequately aligned. Yeah, that is a diagnosis, and therefore we have to align that and improve the way in which these science, technology, and innovation policies are designed and executed beyond the issue of resources. And this will be explained by Marcos Ginasi. Thirdly, an important component of this new vision is the need for articulation and cooperation between multiple stakeholders and at different levels. And here, the so-called cluster initiatives and other productive articulation initiatives are a very effective way of organizing this collaboration. And that's our recommendation for countries, is that cluster initiatives should play a much more central role in the productive development policies. There is evidence both throughout the world and in the region in this sense. And the fourth aspect is that climate change and energy transition imply major opportunities for productive transformation in the region. And therefore, the issues that we have dealt with in these 4 chapters were selected because of their strategic relevance, their supplementary nature. Not everything is encompassed, of course. There are many, many important issues for productive development, such as education and others that we haven't dealt with on this occasion, but they are still fundamental. And therefore, in order to science, technology, and innovation are fundamental boosters for productive transformation. Therefore, that's one of the issues selected. We also deal with collaboration and governance between actors and environmental sustainability are all principles that must guide this new transformational vision. Now, together with these aspects, or all that becomes a roadmap to advance towards a higher, more sustainable growth with better social results, which is what we seek at the end of the day, and also accelerating the achievement of sustainable development goals. So with this introduction, then I would like to offer the floor to Marcos Ginás to present the report itself. Thank you. Thank you, Executive Secretary. And I would like to also greet not only those that are present with us here in our offices in Mexico City, our ECLAC offices, but also greet the hundreds that accompany us online. And that, I believe, evidences the increasing interest that these issues have acquired in the region lately. Let's begin with the first section that deals with productivity and with productive development policies in the region. As already mentioned by the Executive Secretary, the region is trapped into a trap that involves a low growth capacity, which to a large extent explained by a productivity that has remained practically stagnated and has even dropped over the past decade. In addition, in 2017, a turning point took place where average labor productivity at a world level went over and above the average labor productivity in our region. And here it is worthwhile remembering the famous phrase by the Nobel Economics Prize winner, who said that productivity is not everything, but in the long term, it is practically everything. In other words, if the region doesn't deal with this issue of productivity, it will be very difficult for it to tackle other development challenges. And behind that poor performance in terms of productivity, we find a tremendous diversity between countries, both in terms of levels and in terms of the growth of productivity. Indeed, we find how this ranking of productivity is headed by countries such as Guyana, Bahamas, Barbados, Uruguay, Panama, Costa Rica, with important levels of productivity measured as labor productivity per hour that is worked during the week. And we see countries such as Nicaragua and Cuba with much lower levels in terms of productivity. However, the changes in productivity also reveals a tremendous diversity, with countries such as Guyana with an important increases primarily derived from the recent exploitation of hydrocarbon fuels, and yet other countries have reduced their productivity. As we can see, it's worthwhile highlighting that the average for Latin America and the Caribbean between 2024 had an increase of just over 2% in terms of labor productivity, but that increase does not compensate the descending trend in terms of productivity over the past decade. Now, aligned with what we found last year in the first edition of this Panorama, underlying this low performance of productivity, we find heterogeneity in three levels. First of all, a tremendous heterogeneity between the productivity between sectors, with those sectors that are less productive concentrating most of the employment. In addition, we also find and we confirm a tremendous heterogeneity in terms of the sizes of companies between micro and when it comes to micro and SMEs, we find tremendous gaps when it comes when they are compared to the productivity of major companies, but also a heterogeneity which is much more exacerbated vis-a-vis international reference points such as the European Union, evidencing that indeed our companies, including major corporations, are very far from what economists call the technological frontier. In other words, major opportunities for improvement in terms of productivity at a business level. And thirdly, also heterogeneity between territories at a subnational level in our countries. And that is what we find is that in our country, we find different territorial entities coexist with tremendous heterogeneity in terms of labor productivity. Now, in order to boost productivity, we have insisted, and indeed the Secretary has repeated this, that we need a productive transformation, understood as an improvement of the productivity of existing activities, but at the same time taking a leap forward towards activities that involve a higher level of productivity. And for that purpose, we require, what we need is to escalate and improve social development, productive development policies based on a new vision that we have promoted as from ECLAC for some years now. Very quickly, what does that new vision consist of? Well, first of all, we understand these policies as a combination of horizontal and vertical efforts. In other words, efforts that have a cross-cutting impact upon the whole of the economy, but at the same time, of efforts that focus on sectors or clusters or strategic technologies that prioritized by countries within the framework of these policies. Secondly, we understand these policies as encompassing a wide range of sectors of the economy, and not only the manufacturing industrial sector. Indeed, that is one of the reasons why in ECLAC we don't like to talk about industrial policies, but rather of productive development policies. And in order to hold that discussion about the need to prioritize sectors within the framework of these policies, as from ECLAC, we have put forward a portfolio of 14 or 15 sectors or strategic areas, sectors that are boosting sectors and where we believe our region has the tremendous opportunities to improve productivity. In addition, we understand these policies primarily as collaborative, multi-stakeholders and multi-level initiatives, and therefore the issue of governance becomes fundamental. We also understand that these policies include combining efforts in multiple fronts. So we have indeed the issue of science, technology and innovation, which is one of the issues that we discuss during this edition of the Panorama, but we must also combine efforts in terms of digital transformation, in terms of entrepreneurship, in terms of bridging gaps in human talent in terms of foreign direct investment, in terms of negotiations and so on. In other words, combining a whole series of efforts in multiple fronts. In addition, under this new vision, we believe that a significant part of actions in terms of productive development must take place at a local level within territories with local actors. In addition, under this vision, or with this vision, we understand that these policies must be applied under the approach of an experimentalist type of governance, where what prevails is trial and error, repetition, and permanent learning in order to adjust these efforts. In seventh place, as mentioned, and as already mentioned by the Executive Secretary, we believe that cluster initiatives are a way of organizing strategic agendas and of mobilizing key stakeholders around these efforts leading to productive development. And in eighth place, this vision focuses on internationalization. In other words, we're not here talking about the protectionism that existed in the past. Having said that, the region doesn't begin from scratch when it comes to productive development policies. Even more so, many countries are already implementing these policies precisely in this that are present in this new chapter, and we have analyzed 5 countries that have comprehensive policies when it comes to productive development. And we analyzed the case of Brazil with its Nova Industria in Brazil, the case of Chile with its program on sustainable development, productive development, and the case of Colombia with its national policy on reindustrialization, the case of Mexico with the recently launched Plan Mexico, and the case of Peru with the national policy on industrial development. And what we did was to analyze whether these policies in one way or the other comply with criteria or recommendations that we have shared as from ECLAC. For example, whether they prioritize sectors, whether they define resources for these policies, whether leadership takes place at the highest possible level, whether these policies have been the result of a collective construction process, whether they have implemented a territorialization approach, and so on. And we find significant progress when it comes to the implementation of these efforts in the region. However, at the same time, we also find major opportunities to improve, to escalate and improve these policies. Here, it is worthwhile remembering that at the beginning of this year, we launched a supplementary document, supplementary to the previous Panorama, called 113 Recommendations in order to escalate and improve productive development policies in our region. And that indeed leads us to Chapter 2. One of the fronts that has to be improved and escalated are the efforts underway in the region in terms of science, technology, and innovation for productive development. Let us begin with what is obvious, what we already know, and that is that the region evidences that it has fallen behind in terms of investment in science, technology, and innovation. Our region invests in science, technology, and innovation around 0.5 or 0.6% of its GDP, whilst other regions that we want to emulate and follow, such as OECD countries or the US or China, have investment levels in R&D that are greater than 2% of the GDP.
Now, this chapter specifically insists that increasing the impact of science, technology, innovation policies will not just rely on additional resources, but also depend on having coherently designed policies, instruments, and institutions in this regard. So to that end, this chapter conducts a comparative analysis and focuses on assessing the plans and strategies that the countries in the region have with regard to ICTs, institutions, and instruments. Now, to that end, a series of inputs were examined. There was an information review conducted in all the countries in the region. 56 entities throughout the region were consulted. Interviews were conducted in the countries as well. OECD databases, UNESCO databases were consulted, and others. And in other words, there was a widespread literature review, and we believe that there's no precedent of a review of this scope on science and technology information. So what have we discovered? Well, first of all, the science, technology, and innovation strategies, documents, and plans in our countries tend to be involve declarations without specifying responsible parties' budgets or traceability of progress. Only 16 countries have SDI strategy documents and plans. They show good formulation practices, but weaknesses in implementation mechanisms. For example, 88% of the countries analyzed do not have budgets earmarked for these efforts in STI areas. In addition, we have found that STI is a cross-cutting component involving several different government departments, not just housed in STI ministries, and thus this involves challenges regarding coordination. We can see how budgets in several countries are coming from different ministries and agencies. For example, there's the case of Colombia, where the Ministry of STI is not necessarily the agency in charge of giving up most of the resources. Moreover, we have found that there's a wide variety of institutional arrangements for central institutional frameworks on STI policy and budgetary priorities. We have seen that there are different combinations of how the countries lead these efforts. In some cases, in fact, there are entities that draft policies and that implement policies at the same time. Sometimes it's a single institution in charge of both tasks. We have also discovered that the institutions leading STI initiatives show strengths in basic top capacities, technical foresight and operational capacities, but lack more complex or sophisticated capacities. For example, regarding assessment of STI capacity, low adoption of AI, for example, a lack of coordination mechanisms that are stable, as well as a lack of institutionalization of this foresight concept with regard to these policies. Moreover, we have examined the instruments implemented by the countries in STI areas, and we have discovered ample opportunities for improvement in their design and operation. First of all, we discovered that there is a bias towards basic research versus business innovation. We have also found that these documents are primarily guided by beneficiary demands, and they're not necessarily connected to production priorities. We have also seen that there are multiple projects out there with relatively low financial support. Moreover, we have seen short-term initiatives, high level of heterogeneity in terms of design, implementation, evaluation capacities. In addition to that, we have seen that apart from grants, there's low use of other types of support, such as tax incentives, loans, and guarantees, innovative public procurement approaches that we have seen in developed countries. Now, in summary, we have discovered that instead of increasing the presence of these aspects in the STI policies and government budgets, their share is shrinking. And it's challenging because often we have heard that the efforts are not being translated into necessary outcomes. And in some cases, STI ministries have not enjoyed sufficient resources. Now, instead of, well, we're saying that in addition to increasing spending in this area, the region needs to improve the way it designs and implements its STI policies. To that end, we have come up with several specific proposals that depend on the country's institutional development or maturity regarding STI. And we have drawn up 6 areas of action. First of all, we have come up with a series of recommendations to align STI policies with productive development policies. In other words, STI for production transformation of our industry. Secondly, we are recommending strengthening multi-stakeholder coordination and governance, in particular the university business relation component. Thirdly, we are recommending strengthening the top capacities, the technical, operational, political, and foresight capacities of the entities responsible for designing and implementing STI policies. Fourthly, we are also recommending the need to diversify and scale up instruments that are used by our countries in this field. And fifthly, obviously, it's important to include this point. We know that it's necessary to increase STI funding while also improve its targeting and quality. Finally, we are also recommending that the regional countries take advantage of opportunities for regional and extra-regional cooperation and collaboration. And we are here to help with coordinating these regional and extra-regional efforts regarding STI. Now let's move on to the 3rd chapter, which specifically addresses another front, another way we can scale up and improve these policies. And I'm referring to cluster initiatives and other productive coordination initiatives. As mentioned by the Executive Secretary, these initiatives are crucial for production improvement. And at ECLAC, we have insisted on how cluster initiatives and other productive coordination initiatives are a concrete, effective tool for organizing coordination efforts. Now, what do we mean when we say other productive coordination initiatives? Well, we have come up with 3 minimum characteristics, requisites that these initiatives need to meet. For example, they should aim to improve the productivity and competitiveness of the underlying companies of the initiatives. Secondly, these initiatives need to follow a strategic approach, which involves aligning the efforts to achieve key objectives, in addition to having a mid and long-term commitment from the stakeholders involved. And thirdly, these initiatives are supported by participatory governance mechanisms. Now, with these 3 criteria, we essentially cover several different manifestations of these initiatives. We know that cluster initiatives are included therein in the group, but there are other types of initiatives that foster business, corporate networks, supply chain initiatives, various types of initiatives. Now, this type of initiatives, and it's important to mention that these types of initiatives have been behind successful productive transformation processes in other regions of the globe. For example, the Basque region, Catalonia, that they were engaged in a productive transformation process of their own territory, and they applied cluster initiatives as a key tool in their efforts. But we don't have to go so far to find successful stories of these transformation processes. For example, in Mexico, we would like to underscore the case of Nuevo León, Querétaro, and Jalisco, where there were initiatives, cluster initiatives rolled out, or even Medellin, Colombia, where they have been developing cluster initiative-based policies for decades now. In fact, we conducted an assessment to come up with an inventory of these types of initiatives in the region, and we have identified 712 of these initiatives in 20 countries. For example, the countries with the wealth of these initiatives are Brazil, Chile, and Colombia, leading the pack. And moreover, we have different sectors initiatives such as agriculture, manufacturing, tourism, ICT, so on and so forth. We have also discovered that these initiatives are quite versatile with regard to achieving different strategic objectives. They also have a wealth of different financing alternatives. And here you can see that, again, access to new markets and developing production chains are two of the key strategic objectives represented. Now, again, these initiatives do not occur on their own. Rather, they call for specific targeted policies. The chapter actually analyzed 29 production coordination initiatives in the region, and we discovered many different forms of financing for these initiatives. Some countries are providing support in terms of technical aspects. Some countries provide more support with regard to information provision. Other efforts focus on coordination, while others focus on training. Moreover, we have tried to identify the main sectors funded and to understand the main area of implementation. We see that training the workers involved in these initiatives is another key issue. Now, despite the progress in the region regarding this subject, we have also concluded that our region is not taking full advantage of the potential of the productive collaboration initiatives within the region. We have also seen that these initiatives are not necessarily related to the productive priorities defined by the respective countries. Also, there are many initiatives that do not correspond with the productive development initiatives, and there are some countries that, even though they have productive priorities, they are not taking advantage of these initiatives. We have also found that in many cases, these initiatives are just one more program among countless other productive development efforts, and there's not enough importance being placed on these efforts. We have also discovered that the resources earmarked are limited. We have also discovered that there is a great deal of room for improvement for in this area. We have also seen that there's a lack of continuity with regard to implementation, and the outcomes are not evaluated. Now, because we are convinced of the importance of strengthening these initiatives as key components of productive development policies in our region, 2 years ago, we launched the ECLAC platform for cluster initiatives and other productive coordination initiatives. And the platform has a twofold purpose. One is to give visibility to these initiatives and strengthen them at the same time. Now, this platform already includes 411 initiatives registered from 17 countries. And in addition to having all of this statistical information available, we're implementing a series of initiatives through a community of practitioners, and we have been able to pull together thousands of individuals engaged in this subject matter, and we are also launching a series of activities to reinforce these initiatives. Now, all of this has been mentioned because I would now like to refer to the recommendations that we have included under this chapter. The chapter proposes 11 guidelines as well in order to scale up and improve the use of these initiatives. And again, we have proposed 11 guidelines, and we would like to underscore 5. First of all, and this is implicit in what we have already mentioned, one of the recommendations is to use these initiatives to work on strategic agendas around priority sectors under national and subnational production development policies. Secondly, we are also appealing to the countries to increase the resources invested. Thirdly, it's important to ensure the continuity of the policies related to these initiatives, and fourthly, to enhance the evaluation capacity to really understand what's working and what's not working so that we can make the necessary changes. And 5, we are also calling to all to strengthen the IAP platform because we believe it has more potential than it has shown thus far.
With that, we move on to the fourth and last chapter of this report, focusing on productive development policies that are green and inclusive in our region. Now, as mentioned by the Executive Secretary, climatic action provides opportunities to break away from these or to overcome these 3 development traps by the implementation of green and inclusive productive development policies that we understand as a subset of productive development policies that are being promoted as from ECLAC, and that these particularly focus on the generation and adoption of clean technologies in the various sectors. The chapter indeed begins by evaluating the cost of climatic lack of action, climatic inaction. And as we conclude that doing nothing around these issues would indeed make these 3 development traps even deeper. In addition, the chapter also mentions the benefits of climatic action via green and inclusive productive development policies. It is worthwhile remembering the phrase that has been mentioned by Professor Ricardo Hausmann from Harvard University, who insists that regions such as Latin America and the Caribbean should not only focus on how to reduce their emissions, but also on how they contribute to the decarbonization of the world. And in that sense, we find a major possibilities for productive transformation so that our region can aim towards that world decarbonization. Now, what is it that we did in this chapter? Well, indeed, we reviewed productive development policies in certain countries in order to determine the degree of linkages that they had with climatic agendas, and specifically with the climatic objectives defined as from nationally determined contributions. In other words, the commitments entered into by countries in the Paris Agreement. The policies that were analyzed was the Nova Industria in Brazil, the Productive Sustainable Development Plan in Chile, the Industrialization Policy in Colombia, and Plan Mexico here in Mexico. And we analyzed the links between productive development policies and those nationally determined contributions, determining whether those links were implicit and direct, whether they were explicit and indirect, whether there were links, whether they were present or absent in one or the other agenda. And for that purpose, we analyzed different elements that form part of these climatic agendas, especially elements associated to mitigation, to adaptation, the co-benefits and justice considerations, means of implementation, mechanisms and instruments, and also the promotion sectors, whether all this was included in these agendas and whether these agendas included adequate governance mechanisms. And following that analysis, what we did was to put forward recommendations both at a subnational, national, and regional and international levels. And simply as an example, what you can see here is the analysis for the mitigation element, where it was found that at a sectorial level, most mitigation is reflected in productive development policies. However, at an aggregate level, there is tremendous potential in order to improve the coherence of these policies, looking towards mitigation goals. And again, as an example, we present here the analysis that was conducted about the inclusion of boosting sectors within the framework of these agendas, where we found that all policies and the nationally determined contributions that were analyzed include strategic sectors that have been put forward by ECLAC, but we also found that there are some sectors that are not included and that could be included within these agendas. In other words, we found scope for improvement in terms of the connection between the productive development policies and climatic agendas that countries have in place, and all that to finally put forward the recommendations. I would like to insist that these green and inclusive productive development policies represent a tremendous opportunity for the region to be consolidated as a global power when it comes to decarbonization and resilience. And for that purpose, we insist on the need that this scaling up and improvement of policies must take into consideration at an explicit level nationally determined contributions, but also those NDCs could be strengthened by incorporating productive development policy elements. So we also put forward the need to strengthen the ability to manage these policies both at a subnational level using cluster initiatives, but also at a national level, seeking a better coordination, and likewise at a regional level, working with regional sectoral agendas when it comes to green and inclusive productive development policies, strengthening governance, strengthening TOPP capacities, which we believe is an element that comes across in all our chapters. And in addition, we also put forward recommendations linked to political economics that may enable us to build and strengthen coalitions in order to promote this agenda. All that leads us to our final reflections, the last part of this presentation, where basically we echo what the Executive Secretary already mentioned at the beginning of his presentation. In order to overcome the low growth capacity trap, we must escalate productive development policies based on this new vision of these policies. And for that purpose, we are explaining that we must increase the political profile of these policies. In other words, we must make these productive development policies and productivity become a central element of public discussions in our countries. But in addition to that, we are also calling upon the need to delve deeper on how to escalate and develop these policies. In other words, this new panorama of productive development policies 2025 comes or appears together with the ideas that we have been putting forward as from ECLAC over the past few years, aimed at that same direction. We have the platform of cluster initiatives, a network of subnational governments for productive development, what we have been working on within the framework of ECLAC and within the framework of the Science and Innovation Conference. And simply to round up, I would like to say that the problem here is clear, and it is very, very robust. A third lost decade, or the beginning of a new era of high, sustained, inclusive, and sustainable growth based on profound productive development policies. Thank you very much, and we continue with our discussion. Thank you, Marco Ginás, Director of the Productive and Entrepreneurial Development Division at ECLAC. We will begin the Q&A session, and we will begin here in the room for journalists present here. I ask you to speak into the microphone that you will be given, you must speak clearly and loudly so that we can translate the questions. So please identify both your names and the media that you represent. Yolanda.
Buenos días, soy Yolanda Morales.
Good morning, I'm Yolanda Morales from the El Economista. I would like to ask Mr. Salazar what his projection is with regards to the efforts underway in Mexico. In accordance with Plan Mexico, they are trying to promote two industries where I believe we don't have too much experience, but I don't know. I would like to know your experience of the pharmaceutical industry, data center, artificial intelligence. That is what we want to promote. So I'd like to ask you how long it would take us to promote that and whether we have inputs and human capital in order to achieve that. Secondly, I would also like to ask Mr. Yinas whether we can apply incentives to investments in strategic sectors in Mexico if we don't have or undertake a fiscal reform, because often the government has said that this is not within its plans to promote that. And a third question, Executive Secretary, if you allow me. And the question is, what happens if we don't renew the trade agreement with the US, if tariffs are maintained for Mexico as well? Is there life for Mexico after being a trade partner of the most important economy in the world? Thank you, Yolanda. I'll make a brief comment about Plan Mexico, because I'd like to offer the floor to Mr. Martinez, who is the director of the Mexico office and who has indeed been working at length with the Ministry of the Economy and with other agencies around Plan Mexico, and he can provide you with more information in that sense. But as a general answer, in terms of what we have studied, what we have evidenced, and of course we're in contact with authorities, well, we find that there is a lot in Plan Mexico that coincides with the 7 or 8 elements of the new vision presented by Marcos Yinas and that we are promoting as from ECLAC. And in addition, Mexico, I was seen in the diagnosis, is one of the countries that we have included in several of the chapters, and is one of the countries in Latin America that has been working for many decades now on cluster initiatives with very successful cases, aeronautics, in Jalisco, the software cluster, the automobile cluster. And so Mexico already has very good practices, and it's very good for a Plan Mexico to be in place with with top political support. The president herself is supporting this, and this is one of the characteristics of for success when it comes to these policies. So that's as far as I would like to go, and Mario can provide you with greater details. What happens if the trade agreement is not renewed? Well, there is life for Mexico after this, of course, but it would be very bad news if that agreement was not renewed. And in fact, I see little possibility for this agreement not to be renewed. And because of a very powerful reason, more than 80% of Mexico's exports are destined to the US. The competitiveness of several key US sectors rely on supply chains, for example, automobile industry, parts, components, spare parts, and so on, a whole series of things. And so there's an infrastructure, a productive infrastructure, which is very well integrated for North America, because it is now more than 3 decades old with the FTA and now with TMEX. And so, being very realistic, I believe that will inspire, and in the end, it will lead to a very pragmatic vision on the part of all three partners, which has already come across that pragmatism despite the objectives and the initial announcements. And so, I believe that what is most probable is that pragmatism will prevail in the end, and that we will find a successful renegotiation. That is not only our hope, but also based on realities. I believe that would be the most probable scenario. Thank you, Executive Secretary. The specific question on two industries, pharmaceutical, artificial intelligence, and so on. Well, Mexico is a pharmaceutical power. It always has been. It's a major producer of generic products. And Plan Mexico
como dijo el secretario,
as the executive secretary seeks to be in itself a proposal for productive articulation coordinated as from the top levels, and that is a major virtue of the plan. And another virtue of the plan is that it has a very relevant monitoring metric. It has a metric of goals. Plan Mexico seeks to contribute with a percentage of national products, with a percentage in the increase of national procurement, but also in terms of the production of vaccines, in terms of public procurement. And in that sense, that becomes a roadmap. And linked to the question on tariffs, during a time of uncertainty, when uncertainties are exogenous, there's nothing better than having a good national plan in place. And the best policy that Mexico has to face international uncertainty is a good national policy. And a good national policy is linked to Plan Mexico. And now I would like to say something else about Plan Mexico. It has another important virtues. For example,
so we also have proposed different regional development poles, and there are some poles that are more related to the U.S. market, or more related to the domestic market, or more related to primary versus industrial products, and that is, again, another virtue, because under a single plan, we are able to integrate such a diverse nation. And finally, I would like to refer to AI, and perhaps Marco can help with us as an expert in this topic. With regard to AI, nothing has been written, so we need to carry out a major national effort to bring about the infrastructure and the professionals, and to urge participation in this sector. And we know that there's significant risk in leaning on outside sources, and so we need to focus on what lies within, and that's good news, because that's happening. Now, there's a quick question submitted by Yolanda. Thank you for that. A question regarding incentives for strategic sectors, and this is framed by the fiscal restrictions that Mexico faces. And so, Yolanda, this limited fiscal space to deploy initiatives within the framework of the productive development policy is not only inherent to Mexico. We have seen that there are other countries with limited fiscal space as well to make use of these instruments within their productive development effort frameworks. Now, having said that, we are not ruling out the possibility of having incentives within the framework of production development policies. But Yolanda, again, as we mentioned during our presentation several times, we are focusing on having a governance first approach. We know that there are multiple stakeholders involved, and PDPs or the PCIs are one way to coordinate efforts, because the PCIs indicate or identify the needs that must be met in order to boost the productivity of strategic sectors. And it's possible, again, that these may leverage these types of instruments. So we are making an appeal to strengthen these governance frameworks to work on this agenda. Thank you, Marco. There's a second question from someone in the room. Hi, Karen Suarez from El País newspaper. Thank you to all. Now, this is a detailed analysis. Thank you for that. I would like to focus on two things. If we have the prevailing uncertainty conditions, if they continue, how much room do you think that there is to apply the PDPs in Latin America? What would you say that there is? What would you say the risks are? And as far as AI is concerned, how can the region fully take advantage of AI and turn it into a tool and not view it as a threat? Thank you. Thank you, Karina, for that question. I would like to answer the first question, and then I will give the floor to Marco to address AI. Now, in terms of the prevalence of these commercial policies, let's mention that there are different types of commercial policies, and we have the U.S. trades imposed, but there are differences, and then the impact in Latin America really depends on the level of the tariff imposed by the U.S. as well as on the percentage that each country exports to the U.S. versus to Europe versus to China, Asia, and the rest of the world. Now, in that regard, the situation is quite diverse. If you think about the potential impact on Mexico, for example, 80% exports. But the third element here is there is a free trade agreement. So to what extent will that free trade agreement be respected? We know that there are exceptions, but generally speaking, the U.S. has announced that that it is respecting the agreement and the products included under TMEX. Now, as far as Brazil is concerned, the impact, well, there was an announcement of 50% tariff. There are some significant exceptions. For example, the Embraer airplanes. This is a key export, as well as orange juice, as I understand that. We know that Brazil exports a wealth of orange juice. So the effective average tariff apply would be less than 50%. And again, Brazil only exports 11% of its total to US, another 30% to China and Asian countries and other European countries. So Brazil is more diversified in that regard. And let's talk about the differentiated impact. This is a reality. This continues to be negotiated. It's a mobile concept, one could say. And ironically, or paradoxically, instead, there are opportunities for Latin America in this whole context, because let's take a look at the Asian countries. We know that their tariffs are higher than the Latin American ones. Even though Latin America, most of the countries pay 10 to 15% in tariffs, there are opportunities, for example, for Central America regarding a series of products that Asia can no longer export. It's much more expensive for the US to import those products because of the tariffs, and then Central America, the tariffs are lower. That's an example. Now, there's another example for Brazil and Argentina, who are major exports of soybean and other agricultural products. The tariffs, well, you know that that China has taken steps, and there are repercussions for U.S. imports of soybean and U.S. exports of soybean, and so that has brought about significant benefits for Brazil to export to China. So now it's not all bad news. There are opportunities. And again, let's go back to the report. As I said early on, we have this new geopolitical situation, and the international diplomacy role is more crucial than it has been in the past. And today, it's about orange juice or about copper. It's about vital minerals. It's about batteries and lithium, very specific concepts. Now, that means that the governments need to have robust foreign affairs ministries, ministries of the economy. And again, we're talking about the top capacities. It's not. There are some ministries that didn't have to really be fully engaged in the discussion, but today they need to be, because we need to make sure that they did get the most out of these negotiations. And it's important to link the international agenda with the domestic agenda. And with that, I would like to conclude, because again, it's more important today than ever to have productive development policies that are aligned with science, technology, and innovation, and also aligned with how we understand this new geopolitical scenario, because really we could be working over here on the one hand, and when the world is headed in a different direction. Thank you, Karina, for your question regarding artificial intelligence, because again, this allows me to insist on the fact that despite the pessimistic impression that one could have with regard to the three traps that our region is mired in, we continue to be optimistic with regard to the future of our region. And part of this optimism is primarily, specifically due to the digital transformation, and specifically AI as one of these solutions to dig ourselves out of these traps. Again, we have mentioned that with regard to that, we will have to make real effective progress with regard to the use of ICTs and AI, because according to our assessments, they would suggest that we are not effectively and truly using AI or ICTs to their full potential. For example, with regard to the first trap, roughly 96% of SMEs and micro enterprises in our region do not have an internet presence. They do not have a website. Now, let's not forget that SMEs and micro enterprises in our region account for roughly 90% of our production context. Now, if that's the way they are doing with regard to adopting technologies, specifically technology that's so mature as the internet, we can only imagine the gap with regard to adopting AI or blockchain or the IoT, for example. So I would have to say that that is really the key message that we have been trying to convey, that this digital transformation and AI really need to be seen as opportunities to leave behind the development traps. And for a while, we have been insisting on the fact that although AI does have multiple facets, including those related to the risks and the fears regarding new technology and ethics, etc., at ECLAC, we have been primarily focused on viewing these technologies and specifically AI as opportunities to dig ourselves out of these development traps. So in other words, ECLAC is one could say ECLAC should be viewed as the home for IA opportunities. Thank you. Now I would like to read the questions that we have received from online journalists. First, I would like to mention that we are joined by Marco Lini and Felipe Correa from the Santiago, Chile ECLAC Business and Production Development Division. Now we have a representative from the BBC that says, what did the Basque Country, Nueva León, and Medellin do to really bring about this production transformation? What can we do to replicate that? What did Guyana do to be on the top of the ranking with regard to hours worked? And what did Uruguay do as well? Thank you for that question, Cecilia, for these interesting comments. Now, the Basque Country, Nueva León, and Medellin are examples that we cite in the report, and we have studied these regions in depth. Of course, they have differences, but commonalities as well. One would be the methodological approach to the collaborative work. The three of them have embraced the cluster concept, the collaborative work in the sectors that they've chosen and prioritized. They also have specialized institutions. They have excellent coordination with universities, so that they do have commonalities, as I mentioned, and that is one of the success factors. There's a second factor, and it's also linked to the first, and that is when you have institutions, excellence institutions, and these cluster initiatives are co-led and often involve private sector. So that provides continuity. This is contrary to the zigzagging approach that we've seen in our governments at time when we have ministerial turnover. And there's significant continuity with regard to these policies, and that's key because there are cumulative positive impacts over time for boosting productivity. You cannot boost productivity overnight from one administration to the next. And then thirdly, the leadership of the private sector. The private sector has played a key role in these three examples. And when the private sector is involved, we know that the private sector is deeply involved and has detailed information on the niches and the markets, etc. So that's where you bring about improved scenarios when the private sector is leading the initiatives with support and coordination with the public sector with universities and other smaller players, I would have to say that those are the three reasons for the successful experiences. Now, what did Guyana do to lead the ranking? Well, 70% of the 24 GDP corresponds to mining and oil and gas. So extremely high level of productivity because the value of their exports is astronomical. It's significantly capital intensive and not so much labor intensive, excuse me.
Eso sucede
And that also happens in other countries and other territories. You may have a province. There's, for example, a graph that Marco showed where you can see mining that is capital intensive and not so labor intensive. And clearly productivity is better there. So we've seen differences, and this is important as a contribution. Again, of course, we are opening ourselves up to the danger of referring to means and averages, and there are some sectors with high level of productivity, but they're also labor intensive.
Well, there were some issues related to Bahamas and Barbados in second and third place in the ranking, respectively. And there's something that was very important there, which is another very productive sector, which is the financial sector and tourism. And there, Marco perhaps could talk a little bit about the data and the information that we have per country. That's as far as I would like to go with regards to that question. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Another question for you, Natalia Ramos, correspondent of Reuters agency here in Chile. Is it possible to establish how long Latin America and the Caribbean need in order to align their levels of productivity with other regions of the world, and whether recommendations are applicable? Could you talk about the difference between productivity per hour and the productivity factors? We have seen similar trends in the past, and with an improvement of the former in the past. Thank you very much, Natalia, for your question. Is it possible to establish how much time Latin America and the Caribbean need in order to align their levels of productivity with other regions of the world? Where at present, Latin American productivity, as shown in the graph, grows at a rate which is slower than the rest of the world. And that is a tragedy. That means that the region is falling behind, that it is not converging towards the productivity of leading countries, but rather distancing itself from those countries. In 2017, as seen in one of the first graphs showed by Marcos Ginás,
ahí fue menor desde 2017.
Since then, since 2017, then that was slower than the world average, and that was not the case in the past. That means that in one way or the other, we are falling behind, or that there are countries that are moving forward at a much faster pace. And that on top of the experience that we showed last year, in the sense that great, more productive countries, like OECD countries, invest on average 2.5% of their GDP in productive development, whilst we only invest 0.5%. In other words, those are the types of things that we have to improve. The question is very interesting, but I would say that we cannot answer it with certainty. Our recommendations refer to working methods, to the hows and the whats, because they relate to good practices learned by other countries, but everything relies on the approach, the concentration, the scale of public policies, so that public policies, together with academic sectors and with the business sector, can actually take on board these efforts. And nobody could have believed that in 1990 or in the year 2000, how long it would take the Republic of Korea or China to reach the productive development and industrial levels that they achieved in 2020 or in 2020, or where they will be in 2025, or where they will be in 2030, because that depends on many things, not only on internal aspects, on policies, but also on the international context. But what is clear is that if there is no change in mentality, and this is our message in this aspect, that not only mindset or mentality, but that mindset translated into action, well, that is why we're saying that if that does not happen, we will be simply moved like sleepwalkers towards another lost decade. And this is frightening because it's is indeed a very frightening scenario. The second part of the question, the difference between productivity per hour and the productivity of factors. Well, that is quite a technical economic issue in terms of definitions, but in general terms, the way in which talking generally about the behavior, they follow the short, medium, and long-term trend, regardless of the measurement of productivity that is used. Total productivity of factors tries to calculate the impacts of technology and so on, than simply labor productivity, but it is far easier to estimate labor productivity, and because there is greater availability of data for that purpose. But what is important is what we have to analyze this. What is important here is not so much the difference between these two measurements, which is a technical issue, but productivity. But what is important is that productivity. What is the level of rate of growth of productivity within each sector? But what is the productive structure of a country? If a country, for example, has a few sectors that are also capital intensive with a high level of productivity, and most of the employment is in sectors where most of the population works, 80 or 90% of the population, well, part of the question when it comes to productive transformation is not only to increase the productivity of what exists, but how to create what does not exist, the economics of what doesn't exist. And my country, Costa Rica, 30 years ago, let's see, today, the main exports in Costa Rica are, first of all, modern services, secondly, medical devices, thirdly, tourism. 30 years ago, we didn't export one single medical device, and there were no exports because there were no exports of modern services because there was no internet. And so Costa Rica created what did not exist. And so that is part of the challenge, how to attract investments, and that is why ecosystems of startups, for new companies, how they can, and we need to link up to the technological revolution. All this is very important within this context of a productive transformation. Thank you, Executive Secretary José Manuel Salazar Siriñáez. There is a question of the correspondent of France Press in Mexico, Lawrence Cuvillier, for the director of the division, Marcos Ginas. The report doesn't really emphasize education or the update of university programs or technological schools in order to guide them to better benefit from technological resources. Why is that? And the second question, in 2023, during the G77 plus China summit, one of the main approaches was technology transfers from initiating countries to countries that have been left behind. What has happened in that sense over the past 2 years? And a third question, what is it that you can say about international cooperation when it comes to technology geared towards productivity in Latin America? Thank you, Lawrence, for those questions, and especially for the first one. That also enables us to clarify something that the Executive Secretary mentioned during the beginning of the press conference. And deliberately, the report this year does not discuss at length the issues related to education. We deliberately chose to focus on this occasion on science, technology, and innovation, and on productive articulation initiatives, and on the issue of productive green and inclusive development policies. Now, that doesn't mean that human talent is not a key aspect. On the contrary, precisely the issue of identifying and overcoming human talent gaps for productive development is indeed a key role of productive development policies, and that was presented as such at the beginning. It was also an issue that we have been working on in ECLAC for quite a while now. If we don't have human talent available, if we don't have the adequate profiles and competencies required by the productive sector, well, that will become one of the main bottlenecks faced by our economies to achieve productive transformation. I would also like to comment that on October 20th, we will be presenting the results of a project that we conducted between ECLAC, CAF, and ILO, so that within the framework of collaborative governance, we have worked on the agenda of identifying and bridging gaps in human talent. In fact, the cluster initiatives that we analyze this year are institutional arrangements where these agendas must exist in terms of gaps in human talent aimed at productive development. And I conclude by saying that this question could be providing us with some ideas for the panorama next year. Now, with regards to questions 2 and 3, and here I would like to combine the answer by saying that the acceleration of technological transfer and the strengthening of international cooperation in science, technology, and innovation continues to be a key challenge and a strategic opportunity for our region, despite the fact that progress has been made in terms of academic collaboration, human talent training, and the participation in multilateral networks. There are still limitations when it comes to collaboration aimed at overcoming the low growth capacity trap. And that is why, as from ECLAC, we have mentioned the idea to have this approach related to internationalization when it comes to productive development policy. It not only means that we need to position our supply, our value, our supply of a valuable offer at an international level, but rather that we can connect to those sources of science, technology, and innovation throughout the world. Even more so, we have insisted upon the need for our countries to somehow be linked with industrial policies or productive development policies implemented by other countries. And that is why we summoned the Latin American and the Caribbean to benefit from policies such as the ones that were being implemented by the US with its Inflation Reduction Act, or the Science and Chips Act that was also being implemented by the US. But also industrial policies such as the ones promoted by the European Union and even by China. Here, I would like to conclude the answer to this question mentioning that the good piece of news that we could share with you is that we have a tremendous asset, a tremendous positive point with our conference on science and innovation, and we must benefit from it fully so that it can become the space to consolidate collaboration within the region, but also between the region and other regions when it comes to science, technology, and innovation.
Voy a hacer algo un poquito diferente en el sentido
I'll do something which is somewhat different. I don't know whether we will have another question, but there's a dimension of the report that is very important. And we shouldn't waste the possibility of listening to Camila Gramco to talk to us a little bit about this. And that has to do with Chapter 4 that she was in charge of. And that has to do with the role of green and inclusive productive development when it comes to helping countries to overcome the low growth capacity trap. Because that is very interesting, this link between productive development agendas and the productive development agenda and the climatic agenda, because so far they have been very separate and they have been in their isolated silos. But this chapter seeks to undertake that analysis. But I would like Camila to talk to us a little bit about that issue. Camila. Thank you, Executive Secretary. Good morning, everyone. In fact, we, for the first time, explored the links between the productive development agenda and the agenda aimed at climate change. And one of the findings that we obtained during this research is that in accordance with ECLAC estimates in the Latin American and Caribbean region, meeting the commitments in terms of climatic action requires annual investments that are on average close to 5 percentage points of the regional GDP. Now, these massive investments can stimulate long-term economic growth, but what is most important, and this is something that we investigated in the report, that may also be a boost for productive transformation capable of promoting productivity and long-term growth. However, these long-term social and economic benefits derived from decarbonization and from green investments that would lead to this decarbonization can only be materialized via productive development policies, ensuring that at least a part of these solutions are sustainable and no carbon solutions are generated in the region. Latin American and Caribbean countries are very well poised to become fundamental actors in the supply of technologies, products and services with low carbon emissions, not only for themselves at a national level, but also at a regional level, and also for the rest of the world. On October 9th of this year, we began in Belém do Pará in Brazil. We launched COP30 in Brazil, which will involve a tremendous opportunity to discuss these issues. Latin America and the Caribbean have a tremendous potential, a tremendous ability to be protagonists in the provision of these sustainable low carbon solutions. And as we researched and investigated and put forward in chapter 4 of the report that we're launching today, the development of green and inclusive productive development policies are a road to contribute to a more sustainable, inclusive and fair future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Camila. I just wanted to add something important. And again, linking the national and regional policies with what's going on around the world. Camila talked about the potential to contribute to decarbonization, and Marco also did. But now there's a new topic called power shoring. It's not, one could say it's similar to nearshoring. It sounds the same, but anyhow, power shoring refers to energy shoring, if you will. So what is this concept? Well, the concept is that we are a region, and one of our assets is that we have an extremely high percentage of water. We have an electric power grid with the highest share or surpassing the global average of hydropower. We have deserts, etc. For solar power, for wind power, we have oceans and plains. So there's a great deal of potential in the region in attracting this type of activity like we've done in the past, and attracting medical device markets and nearshoring. So we can attract energy-intensive investments, including all of the data centers and all of these servers that consume a great deal of power. And to the extent, of course, that this is not at the cost of not providing our society with the energy that we need. So anyhow, that's what comes as a power shoring. So this type of creative thought process with regard to PDPs and with regard to what's going around the world and the geopolitical context is one of the aspects that we would like to stimulate. And it's part of this overall discussion. Thank you. Thank you. Secretary, I would like to ask if any of the journalists present here in the room would like to ask another question. Sandy, yes, they are going to provide you with a microphone.
Muchísimas gracias. Buenos días, señores, señoras.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am from the Xinhua News Agency in China, and I have a question for you. Now, we have noticed that in the publication, you have referred to productive development policies. And this notion is similar to a Chinese concept, which is what we call new quality production forces. Now, since China and Latin America and the Caribbean are developing regions, I have a question for you. Is there consensus among the parties with regard to development aspects? And if so, in what way, where do you think we can exchange ideas and collaborate with regard to industrial and trade aspects? Thank you. What is your name again? Marina. Thank you. It's a pleasure. Who would like to answer this question? Secretary? Thank you, Marina. That's an interesting question. Now, it's interesting to see that in China, you have this concept of new quality productive forces. That's very similar to what we've been talking about. You're absolutely right. It's about how we can bring about sophisticated, technologically sophisticated quality production fabric involving new technologies and other aspects. So anyhow, the question is, what can we learn from China and what do we have in common? Well, with regard to China's size, China is the country that has had the most substantial transformation over the last 30 years. Some authors refer to the first Chinese shock. China is a major manufacturing powerhouse, and many at first saw that it was with the low-level light manufacturing, but it's changed. And China today has a significant technological capacity and is leading many technological sectors that it did not lead in the past. So I would have to say that the first lesson is to validate, again, regardless of how, because that really depends on each domestic approach, but it can be done. China has taken millions of people out of poverty, and China just recently announced that it no longer will request that the WMO consider it for special differential treatment. No longer a case. So China has risen in prosperity levels. In fact, from 2000 to present, 6% of it's gone from accounting for 6% of the global GDP to roughly 18%. So it's tripled its share in the global GDP. China is able to produce things that other countries can't do, given its idiosyncrasies and its political system, etc. And there are several lessons, several other principles that we are recommending, in fact, are relevant. But I would say that the first lesson, is that yes, it is possible when a government and society really sit down and focus on their objectives and have this level of ambition and are willing to take on the productive development agenda. Transformation is possible. My country, for example, has been successful. The Dominican Republic as well. Many individuals talk about the successes of Mexico. Marco presented the platform that we have at ECLAC that has houses roughly more than 700 cluster initiatives. So there's a very long, relevant list of world-class initiatives. What about Brazil? Brazil's exporting Embraer aircraft and medical devices as well that are being exported, and the competitive role of Brazil and Argentina in the food industry is incredible as well. So there are several examples. I'm sure I haven't answered all of your entire question, but those are my comments.
No, de pronto para complementar la respuesta del secretario a la
I just wanted to add to the Secretary's comments. Thank you, Marina. It's an excellent question. I would like to mention that there is potential for synergies with regard to PDPs in our region with the production development and industrial policies. That's all part of the agenda that we have been working on at ECLAC. In that regard, we have been fostering spaces and opportunities to have synergies with different industrial policies of the countries, with the US, with the European Union. And in fact, we have had a few opportunities to talk about synergies with regard to productive development policies in Latin America and the Caribbean and China's industrial development policies. So in short, allow me to reply by saying that there is a forum that we should better leverage to seek out these ties and connections at the the highest political level with regard to technological and production related aspects. It's the ECLAC China Forum. And we have already seen that at that forum, they are discussing these aspects, but it's nascent and there is room for growth. Thank you, Marco. Now, we will conclude with 3 questions that we have received. Unfortunately, we do not have time to read or answer all of the questions that we've seen from journalists throughout the region. Anyhow, this question is from Marco Ginas from Irma Cantisano, the head of the economist in El Salvador. Now, why is El Salvador is one of the countries with the lowest level of productivity in Latin America. Why is that? Where should El Salvador focus to revert this trend? And has progress been seen over the last 5-year period? Thank you for that question, Irma. Actually, yes, it is true that the levels of productivity in El Salvador are low. For 2024, the country had labor productivity per hour of week of $230, which means that for each hour worked, there's a very low compensation. The average in the LAC region is 590, and for El Salvador, it's 230. And in fact, from 2020 to 2024, productivity in Salvador measured this way only increased by 4.8%. That is on average 0.95% annually, which is lower than 1%. So in that regard, well, in a country such as El Salvador, there are multiple reasons for this low productivity. I would have to take an entire morning to delve deeper into these specificities. But again, this is one of the messages that we have tried to reinforce and convey today, and that is in order to revert this trend of low growth and low productivity, it's crucial for El Salvador to scale up and improve its productive development policies. Now, again, we are talking about a standard. We are addressing all of this as if it were a standard approach, but there's nothing standard behind all of this. One needs to have a specific national tailored approach or territorially tailored approach, and one needs to take into consideration the country's production infrastructure, institutions, etc., and also taking into consideration the institutional capacities of the countries and the territories. And again, there's a very broad work agenda blooming out of there, and hopefully at ECLAC we can continue to delve deeper in what we've been doing with El Salvador and other countries on these matters. Thank you, Marco Ginas, for those remarks. There's a question for the Executive Secretary, Mr. Salazar Sininach, from Carmen Mariel Esquivel, the correspondent from the Prensa Latina in Chile. The question is, so the Caribbean is an area significantly affected by weather phenomena such as hurricanes and increasingly more destructive. So agriculture also has low productivity levels. So given this context, what does ECLAC recommend to these nations to boost their productivity? And how much do protectionism barriers have an impact on this, on the production development in Latin America? And when I'm referring to protectionism barriers, I'm including tariffs in the US and others. Thank you for those questions. I'm glad to see there's a question regarding the Caribbean. We know that there's no doubt that climate change exists, and the statistics are showing a worsening situations, hurricanes, etc. Unfortunately, the Caribbean is significantly affected by that. There's also an impact because of lack of water, drought, water scarcity, flooding, landslides, so on and so forth. Also, fires, for fires. So natural disasters are on the rise, and ECLAC has a methodology to evaluate the impacts and the damages and how to reconstruct. But the question is, okay, what can be done with regard, or what do we recommend with regard to production? Well, the Caribbean, 70% of the population lives on low-lying coastal areas, and that clearly involves existential threats. Most people live close to the sea level, and so storms, and we've seen that there's been an increase in meteorological events significantly over the years. So the statistics do not lie in this case. And so clearly one of the most affected sectors, apart from housing along the coast, are the agricultural and livestock areas. In the Dominican Republic, 40% of the municipalities have a high level of agricultural vulnerability. So again, what do we propose? Well, there is an agenda on the one hand. That's not a productive development agenda per se, but it's an adaptation agenda, climate change preparation and adaptation agenda related to early warning systems and other initiatives. Early warning systems are helpful for evacuation, and these are investments that the countries need to make, and they're doing this to some extent. Now, the broader question regarding possibilities in the Caribbean is hard. We've been working on that. We have sub-regional office for Mexico and for the Caribbean, and we've been working with them and with other agencies such as development banks. And clearly tourism is one area where the Caribbean has a world-class competitiveness. There are opportunities for better chain supplies. Unfortunately, the tourists are imported, and Guyana is part of the Caribbean, but there are other countries with agricultural capacity. So there is a robust agenda to do more there. And we know that millions of people in the tourism industry need to be fed. And so there are other modern services that we recommend. We're talking about that with the Caribbean, this whole concept of the blue economy as well, involving the oceans. There's great potential there. And there are other examples out there as well. The problem is that these are small economies and they're island economies as well. Unfortunately, the costs to reach the region is quite high. So that it's a vicious cycle. They don't have a critical production mass, and so the boats have to show up, and there's limited services, standard services connecting the Caribbean to the rest of the world. There are, for example, no ports in Guatemala, Costa Rica, Honduras, so you have to arrive to the Caribbean via Miami. So all of that makes it increasingly more challenging. And now, all of that is to say that we're working on this. But when there is a question related to PDPs for the Caribbean, it's a whole different universe. With regard to protectionism barriers, I think I already answered that to a certain extent earlier. And the impact of that really depends on the share of exports per country, the level of tariffs applied, and whether or not the countries have free trade agreements with the US and whether or not these will be respected by the US. I also mentioned that despite of course, this is not good news for Latin America. There is good news for Latin America when we compare Latin America to Asia and to other countries. The tariffs are lower, so there are opportunities. Exports that were once coming from Asia are no longer coming from Asia, but they're coming from Latin America. So anyhow, some exports that the US that are too expensive for China now from the US are being substituted by the regional countries. So thank you, Executive Secretary, for those comments. There's another question from the Caribbean for the Director of the Sub-Regional ECLAC Office in Mexico, Mr. Martinez. Cadena Costa from the region. What is the outcome of this study, specifically in regard to the Dominican Republic, and what needs to be carried out to secure an appropriate transformation? How can the Dominican Republic take part in green, inclusive, productive development, and how would that translate into benefits for the people? And how does the Dominican Republic stand with regard to the region in terms of science, technology, and innovation clusters and production development initiatives? Thank you for that question to journalist Acosta from the Dominican Republic. Now, we need to understand two key aspects regarding the DR. This is a country that has stood out in recent years, many years, for its growth rate. The Dominican Republic, one could say, is a country that is proving to have good domestic plans, good domestic coordination and effectiveness. And this is reflected in the ranking that we have prepared for this report, the ranking on productivity. So the DR is above the regional average. I think it's in rank 13 out of 28 in the report. And again, this is correlated with its high growth strategy and history and in investments, etc. We also need to underscore that the DR has a very interesting past in terms of production initiatives and coordination, both in the public and private sectors. And I would have to say that this historical dialogue is really yielding results. I would like to provide you with two examples to illustrate this. I think they're good examples because they have political and foresight vision. One is the National Innovation Plan 2030 and the Dominican Republic 26 Development Plan. Both plans link the public state leadership in production development with the rest of the society. And I say the rest because not just the private sector, includes academia as well as civil society organizations, active ones. And the goal, for example, of it's a very ambitious, similar to the Mexico plan, because it's high level state decisions that are making this happen and coordination, and it's really changing the course. I would also like to mention that in terms of challenges, there's a significant one regarding innovation. Definitely the country's deficient in terms of innovation, like most of the region. So as Marco said, it's not about investing more, it's about investing better and using the resources more strategically. And there's also a challenge with regard to linking this to human needs and having a private sector with a future vision. And the country has identified this and is tackling the problem. And Costa asks about green development and how can the DR leverage this. I think there's a key link here. Now, because it's a Caribbean country, obviously it faces all of the challenges mentioned by the executive secretary, and that there's a high incidence of extreme climate events. But at the same time, the DR has an interesting production response. It can meet needs through their production innovation. So the environmental challenges could also be benefits. Now, for the production sector, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Camila Graham-Cow that has studied the link between development and the potential of green economy for productive development. So go ahead, Camila. Thank you, Jorge Mario. Chapter 4 addresses this. It's one of the major issues we researched. And the findings showed us that in order to secure sustainable, inclusive, productive development in Latin America and the Caribbean, we need to reinforce capacity for transformation management. This is something that ECLAC has been reinforcing as a concept in recent years. To that end, and today's publication underscores the importance at different levels. At the subnational level, this involves promoting cluster initiatives and productive coordination initiatives. At the national level, it involves reinforcing coordination among productive development policies and climate-related commitments taken on by each country and vice versa. So there are key opportunities for strengthening climate policies by including productive development policy components under the climate policies. In that regard, we recommend strengthening governance structures. In fact, there are some case studies in the chapter referring to different governance situations. Unfortunately, the speaker's connection is breaking up and it's not sufficient for interpreting.
Vamos a retomar la respuesta. Voy a pasar a otra pregunta.
I'm going to move on to another question while the signal improves.
Ustedes me avisan si lo podemos retomar. Voy a aprovechar
We'll
para
come back to you.
Manuel Salazar, de María José Núñez, periodista de Semanario Universidad de Costa Rica.
This is a question from Costa Rica. I'm interested in analyzing the dual Costa Rican realities. They have successful duty-free areas, but that don't lead to all that much. And then you have local agro-industrial production. How does ECLAC view this, and how should these be addressed to have an equal playing field? And what is the specific situation of the specific perspective of Central America? Thank you for the question. There are two productive realities in Costa Rica. Yes, Costa Rica has been very successful, one could say, over the last 30 years, roughly, in attracting investment through the duty-free regions. For example, there's been a boom of modern services, medical devices, etc. And this means that the export portfolio has radically changed. But, well, we could say that there are two parallel realities, but it's more sophisticated than that. There are nuances. It's not that it's more sophisticated. There are some nuances there. So it's not black and white, this whole concept of dualism. Now, 15% of the labor force works in the duty-free areas. The rest is 85%. They do not work in the duty-free areas. As out of that 85%, 20% work in the public sector. And then let's not forget about the modern sectors, such as the financing sector, insurance sector, and tourism. Tourism, well, more than 500,000 people work in the tourism sector. Double the individuals in the duty-free sector. It's an extremely dynamic sector. Interesting because there are leading companies there, hotel groups, etc. Excellent productive chain that involves SMEs, niche tourism.
Hay muchísima gente y mucha pequeña y mediana empresa. Muy democrático, se puede decir que es el sector allá.
So,
ahora, en cuanto a los efectos de derrame, que también era parte de la pregunta, generalmente se piensa que no hay muchos efectos de derrame, que son una especie.
Generally speaking, there's not a lot of overspill effects. Many Costa Rican professionals work, highly qualified professionals, high-level professionals in multinational companies working in medical device sector and other sectors. Many of them have come up with their own entrepreneurial activities. So there's a lot of lessons learned there.
¿no? Que van a eso. De manera
So it's an interesting situation there. There's also chains going backwards and forwards. But again, medical devices is one of the most sophisticated niches with extremely high technical standards for the providers and vendors. It's a very difficult industry to get engaged in. There has been a vendor development program and there's an vendor ecosystem. Many of them are foreign, though, because they were previously certified as vendors. And there are some Costa Rican companies that have managed to be engaged in this sector, though. I would say level the playing field. That cannot be by decree or resolution. Again, what we need is to scale up the productive development policies in the other sectors.
tecnología, pero hay que trabajar con los sectores.
Where we can have technology transfer, and we also need to work in local sectors. There are several crucial issues. Education, for example, vocational training, infrastructure, all of these are important. Digital skills, working close. And they have been working on industrialization policies as well, and tourism sector has grown significantly as well, and they're banking on that as well. So in short, in order to reduce the dualism, what you need to do is work more on productive development policies, specifically in the applicable to the more lagging sectors where you could foster training, education. Someone talked about the SMEs; they don't even have websites, and in this era of e-commerce, that's a crucial tool. Thank you to the executive secretary. Thank you, Camila, for coming back. Would you like to conclude your previous idea?
¿Me estén escuchando bien? Ojalá que sí.
Sí, todo bien.
I hope you can hear me now.
Sí, no, gracias por devolver la palabra, en fin, para concluir aquí el mensaje respecto a la
I would just like to conclude with my message regarding managing transformations, specifically the productive transformation, green, sustainable, inclusive production transformation. Chapter 4 includes several different recommendations, multi-level recommendations, for example, nationally, the importance to promote cluster initiatives and coordination initiatives. Nationally, we have identified opportunities to strengthen governance structures between ministries or between secretariats so that the ministries managing productive development policies may coordinate with climate policies and others. Regionally, the chapter recommends strengthening integration and cooperation in the LAC region by standardizing technical parameters, having common taxonomies for sustainable investments that the region could attract, and strengthening existing regional coordination mechanisms such as those led by ECLAC, such as the Regional Technical Forum for Energy Planners, or the Standing Lithium Forum, or the Parliamentarian Climate Change and Just Transition Observatory, as well as the Science, Technology, and Innovation and Communications Conference. Now, globally, the chapter underscores the significant advantage of holding COP30 in Brazil this year. This COP30 will be the Latin American Caribbean COP. and this will be a platform for addressing common issues among the region, specifically regarding fair transition, all under this concept of productive, inclusive development. Thank you.
Camila Gramkov, directora de la
Thank you to Camila Gramco, the director of the ECLAC regional office in Brazil. And with that, we will adjourn.
CEPAL, compartir la reflexión.
I would like to give the floor to the executive secretary to refer to the final reflections on this document. Again, thank you to all of you for joining us here today. Thank you to the journalists and other individuals joining us. Thank you for the wealth of questions. Those that we have not been able to answer, we will answer in writing. And I think the principal message, and hopefully we have convinced you, is that it's crucial for Latin America to focus on productive development policies and place these at the core of their overall discussions. These include industrial policies, but it's more the industrial sector. We have Industry 4.0, include modern services, modern agriculture, etc. So that's why we talk about productive development policies and not industrial policies. So that's the way forward. That's where the toolbox is. We have our colleague from China here, and if we look at the Asian countries and countries that have been able to leave poverty behind and seek secure high levels of prosperity and have long periods of intense dynamic development, have done so because they have applied productive development policies very similar to our vision, our new vision. So this is the call and the message, and we would like to thank you, the community of journalists, for making sure that this is a topic constantly addressed. If it weren't, we know that there's protectionism and tariffs and new winds, and it's possible that in a few years' time, we will be talking about how to avoid this fourth lost year decade. We don't want that to happen. We have to prevent that from happening. And what we're doing today, this discussion will help us in that. And hopefully this discussion has filled you all with hope. Thank you. Daniel Colin from TN323 from Guatemala, Francia Guarejola from Honduras, Daniel Salazar from Bloomberg Online, Maria Martinez Moore, correspondent from Chile, Mirta Rodriguez from Estrella in Panama, and Beth Saldaña, journalist from Universal in Mexico, and Madarina Costa from the Dominican Republic. Thank you to all of you for having sent your questions in writing. You will be receiving an email response to your concerns. We would also like to thank you all for joining us and for your attention. And we remind you that all of the informational material related to this Panorama publication are already available on ECLAC's website, and the press team is available for future questions and concerns. Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.